My name is Neil Swidey, and I'm the director of the journalism program here at Brandeis. And on behalf of our all-star journalism team, the Dean of Arts and Sciences, and our co-sponsors in politics, sociology, and international and global studies, I'd like to welcome you to the 2025 Elaine Wong Distinguished Lecturer Program. We're thrilled to be hosting legendary New York Times executive editor Dean Baquet, as well as a pair of brilliant scholars, historian Gary Gerstle and sociologist Sarah Soberai. This week marks the 4th anniversary of our very first Brandeis Journalism Forum. We held that first one virtually because it was at the height of the pandemic with Dr. Fauci and Atul Gawande. We had no idea if there would be much interest. When more than 5,000 people signed up for it, our IT staff had to scramble to upgrade the university Zoom license. Okay, we thought, there seems to be some interest. We've hosted another forum every semester since then. The topics change, but the goal doesn't. It's to get our students engaged in conversations that prompt reflection and illumination in the best tradition of journalism. Previous headliners have included Marty Baron of the Washington Post, Judy Woodruff of PBS, and this past fall, top New York Times lawyer David McCraw. David, I'm happy to say, is back in the audience today. He just flew in from LA after attending the Oscars on Sunday, palling around with Conan and the Clooney's. You know, our journalism students whose parents all want them to go to law school already think David is living the dream, so now the Oscars. We're delighted to welcome back to campus retired Dean Elaine Wong, the namesake of this lecture. You'll soon hear more about Elaine, but just know that she was a beloved fixture on this campus for nearly 40 years, and she attended every one of our events. Our guest of honor tonight is Dean Baquet. He was until recently the executive editor of the New York Times. As an investigative reporter, he won the Pulitzer Prize. As an editor, he led the newsroom in a raft of amazing award-winning projects, including the Harvey Weinstein Me Too coverage. Today, he leads the Times Local Investigations Fellowship, mentoring reporters at smaller outlets. You may know that he was the first Black executive editor of the New York Times, and before that of the LA Times. After getting the top job in New York, Dean remarked, quote, "Of the half dozen biggest newspapers in the country, only 2 of them have had Black top editors, and both of them have been me." As always, Dean was a trailblazer, though, and that list thankfully has gotten a little longer since then. With 11 million subscribers, digital subscribers, the Times is now the biggest English language news publisher in the world. So it's easy to forget just how shaky the operation looked when Dean took the helm back in 2014. He wasn't just a principled, fearless leader, but also an incredible force of innovation. And one last thing about Dean, journalists can be kind of a cranky bunch, but everyone loves this man. And I think you'll see why soon. We're thrilled to have so many accomplished journalists in the crowd with us today from New York and Boston, including Dean's counterpart at the Boston Globe, editor Nancy Barnes. The guests here are friends of ours going way back, but the real reason they've made time to be here today is their deep admiration for Dean and his work. All right, just a quick few programming notes and introductions, and then we'll get into it. Our forum today will be in 2 parts, with lots of time for audience questions. Our first panel will be Dean in conversation with 2 of my talented colleagues right here, Professor of the Practice Ann Silvio is an Emmy winner whose courses include documentary journalism, truth and fact, and one new one coming this fall called The Art of the Interview. She pushed innovation through legacy media organizations, starting at the Boston Globe and then at CBS News. For a decade, she was a senior producer at 60 Minutes, founding its digital operation and serving as host of 60 Minutes Overtime. Ann was also the driving force behind bringing Dean to campus, so we're grateful for that. Adriana Lacey is our assistant director overseeing internships and outreach. Her courses include social journalism, sports journalism, and a new one she is developing on AI. Adriana previously served as audience editor for the Los Angeles Times, Axios, and Harvard Neiman Foundation. For her work founding the website Journalism Mentors, Forbes magazine named Adriana a 30 under 30 honoree. It's been great working with them and our other colleagues at this event. A shout out to our indispensable Special Projects Manager, Jillian Brzozowski, for her organizational prowess. After our first panel ends, our visiting journalist will step out to meet with some of our university colleagues. We encourage everyone else to stay here in this room. Our student leaders have a fun program of Journalism Jeopardy with food and prizes, and so it'll be a lot of fun. And please stay, enjoy that, and see our students at work. Also, we know all of our students are here today because they really want to be here, but if you are required to be here for one of your classes, there's a QR code that you can scan. Just a little pro tip. Then at 7 p.m., we'll all reconvene here for our second panel. That's when I'll lead a conversation with Dean and Gary Gerstle and Sarah Soberai in a discussion about the deeper roots of polarization. And how we might move forward. If you found yourself grasping for answers after watching the news, like Friday's Oval Office face-off with the Ukrainian president, trust me, you'll want to stick around for our panelists' perceptive insights on that. Finally, it's my pleasure to introduce our interim president, Arthur Levine. As president of Teachers College at Columbia and then president of the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation, Arthur built an impressive track record as a transformational leader in higher education. A 1970 Brandeis grad, he returned to campus last fall, and he quickly made it clear he was interested in nothing less than reimagining the liberal arts education. Arthur is also the author of 13 books. Is that right, Arthur? 13. You're putting us professional writers to shame here. So he clearly understands. He understands the ties that bind journalism and higher ed. At Columbia, he created the innovative Hechinger Institute for Education in the Media, named after the former education editor of the New York Times. So please join me in welcoming President Arthur Levine.
Good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank you all for coming to hear me give this introduction. How very, very fortunate we are to have today's guest and all the other people who are visiting campus today. Thank you. It's a powerhouse audience. Now, look, you all know this. There's nothing new about this. The United States is undergoing profound, can't wait to see what I wrote, profound, swift, and accelerating change. We're moving from a national analog industrial economy to a global digital knowledge economy. The last time the nation went through change of this magnitude was during the Industrial Revolution, when all of our social institutions and the entire nation were transformed. And that's going to happen again now. Then as now, there was extraordinary division in the country. The change brought big winners and very big losers, brought a sense of uncertainty, fear, anger, a desire on the part of some to re-embrace the past. It also brought a timidity and an inability to act on the part of many of our government officers. Others have not felt that way. If John Kennedy tried to write Profiles in Courage today, the pickings would be very spare. The fact of the matter is, at a time in which democracy is clearly imperiled, journalism, the fourth estate, is going to be one of the most powerful forces we have for helping us maintain our democratic society. And they've been there throughout history. During the Gilded Age, what we saw were people like Ida Tarbell write about the abuses of Standard Oil. We saw Upton Sinclair writing about the shame of the meatpacking industry. We saw Jacob Rees writing about poverty and about immigration. And when McCarthy came to the fore, at a time which government would not speak up, Edward R. Murrow did. He paid to broadcast his own shows because CBS wouldn't. And he attacked McCarthy and McCarthyism at a time in which that wasn't being done. During the Watergate era, we had two young reporters, Woodward and Bernstein, bet their careers on what the future might bring, on the kind of practices that Nixon White House was engaged in. Journalists have given their careers and too many their lives in defense of freedom, in defense of democracy. And I guess one of the lessons is we all have the ability to affect change, whether it's higher education, whether it's media, whether it's elsewhere. At Brandeis, we're trying to reinvent the liberal arts for the global digital knowledge economy. So let's start this program and let's hear about the kinds of things that you've concluded about how we save a deeply divided society. Thank you very, very much.
Welcome to Brandeis, Dean.
That was pretty great. Thank you. Tough act.
Can you say that louder?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, President Levine, and thank you, Professor Swidey, for hosting this exchange of ideas. Since the audience is peppered with journalists today, I would be remiss if I didn't start with some news. And by the way, this is a full house today. If any students want to come and sit on the sides, please feel free. It's been reported that the Washington Post just lost 75,000 subscribers when its owner, Jeff Bezos, made a change to the editorial page. He announced in a staff memo that the opinion page of the Post would now advocate for personal liberties and free markets and would not publish opposing viewpoints. News reports have noted that Mr. Bezos has considerable business before the federal government. How do you see this latest move by Bezos at the Post, and what would you say to him if given the opportunity?
You know, it's, I think frankly that if the Post does not invite opposing views on a whole range of subjects, it's squandering a moment to be one of the leaders of a discussion that I think the country really needs to have now. The publisher gets the right to determine the direction of the editorial page. I also want to say, having competed with the Post newsroom and also as being an avid reader, the Post news report is terrific. So put that over here. But I think this is a moment where, as the president said, we're in an avid debate about democracy, what democracy means. We're in the middle of we're gonna be in an avid debate about everything from tariffs to, I suspect, the First Amendment. And I don't think this is a time for one of the major leading news organizations to narrow that discussion. And what I'm most nervous about, though obviously I'm speculating, is that he is a very unusual publisher and that he has wide interests apart from the newspaper. And it looks to me like he has put the interests of those wider interests from his space program to Amazon itself ahead of the newspaper, which is obviously a small part of what he owns. And I think that at a moment when we're going to need there are very few big, robust news organizations in existence now, because we happen to be in a crisis where so many of them have actually been taken over by large corporations or have been cut. And I think for the Post to retreat from that discussion would just be terrible for the country.
Hmm. And is there any space, as someone who has made controversial decisions at a struggling newspaper at a
Yeah.
time when it was struggling financially. Is there any room in your mind for allowing him some runway?
Yeah, you know, if this was the only thing he did, in fact, if you go back to the first controversial decision where he decided to pull an endorsement of Kamala Harris, I think if he had said a year ago, I mean, here's just a little bit of background. I don't think it's great for democracy that the greatest American news organizations have very narrow slices of the audience. And that includes the New York Times and the Washington Post. That's also not great for democracy. I don't think it's great for democracy that the Washington Post was losing a ton of money. That's just not sustainable. That's also not great. Had he come in a year before the election and said, look, we're all struggling to build credibility. We're all struggling to figure out how to have a broader audience. So one thing I'm not going to do is I'm not going to do it. If he had said that a year before, I would give it. I mean, I completely would give it. It's another attempt at a solution to a really powerful problem. It's the fact that he did it just before the election. So if you take that, his appearance on the dais at the inauguration, which to my mind, I've never had a publisher who would appear on the dais of a president's inauguration, any president. The fact that Amazon is going to spend $40 million to make a documentary about Melania Trump, and by all reports outbid everybody else for it. I think if you add, and the fact that he made $1 million contribution to the inaugural fund, I think it's all those things combined that make me nervous. If it had just been, you know, his decision to say, look, here's the direction I want for the editorial page. I get that. That's not only fine, it's within his purview. It's this combination of acts over the last couple of months that really have to call into question how he regards the role of being owner of, frankly, one of the handful of truly treasured news organizations.
No, that's a really great point. And I wanted to go back a little bit, talk a little bit about the news reporting. Right now, a lot of the things that Bezos is doing is on the opinion side. Mike's. No worries. These sound better anyway. But just going back to the newsroom, he hasn't, necessarily interfered in the way that I think some people have worried about. But he has made changes, whether that's, new executive editors, potentially rethinking the way that the newsroom does its journalism. They have very, very ambitious plans to grow the newsroom, to grow subscribers. And a lot of times, there's a lot of difficult trade-offs that need to be made between journalistic principles sometimes and business decisions to expand the audience. Looking at the changes at the Washington Post, how do you think a newsroom should really balance editorial integrity with the financial realities of growing a readership like the Post?
I don't think you should ever compromise your editorial integrity. But I do think that sometimes when institutions are in the middle of change, I think you'll find that if you try to reimagine liberal education, sometimes people get confused about what is actually editorial integrity and what is just habit.
Yeah.
And to me, the one of the hardest things about leading an institution in the middle of change is to really try to figure out what's our core. What are the things that really matter? And if that list is too long, you're not going to change. And when I say that, I'll use as an example in the newspaper business. The way we wrote news stories in the print era, anybody in here who's ever written a news story, it is not a natural way to write. Okay. We were all forced to learn how to write in the pyramid style, right? We were forced to do it. And it became such a part of our DNA that if you polled journalists, they actually said, this is who we are. It actually isn't who we are. It was a technological innovation in the era when news stories had to get cut from the bottom. That's not, that's the way of writing is not who we are. So I think you gotta make sure that the things you're fighting are actually the things that you're about. Of course, integrity, printing only truth, those are the things you fight for. But sometimes I think institutions in general get confused about which things are core and which things you fight for. Of course, editorial integrity is among them. And which things are just sort of habits that you've done for so long that they feel like who you are.
I want to switch gears and talk about, go back to the day in 2015, June 2015. Your executive editor of the New York Times, Donald Trump, comes down the golden elevator in New York City and announces his White House run and begins to operate really as if the media is the opposition party. Looking back at all the attacks against the media and specifically the New York Times, what really worked? What was effective? And what can newsroom leaders today learn from that?
You mean what was effective?
What were his attacks?
Okay, what were his?
Really worked?
You know, I think frankly, I think a lot of them worked. I think one reason that news organizations are struggling with an issue of trust is like a guy who has, you know, controlled anywhere from 30 to 45% of the American vote, constantly day in and day out beats us up. That's not to say we don't make mistakes, not by any stretch, but it's hard to you know, we're also not very good at defending ourselves. We have a very arrogant tradition that comes from the era when newspapers made a ton of money in advertising and actually didn't kept a little distance from the audience, which was a mistake. So he would attack us and we would say, we stand by our stories. That's not good enough anymore. If I had to do it over again, when he started attacking specific stories, I think I would have set up a way to defend them. The Times does this much better now. But in the beginning, we didn't quite, I think we were taken aback. First off, nobody thought he was going to win. So we didn't pay quite as much attention to the attacks. He didn't think he was going to win, by the way. But I think, so here's what I think we have tried to do since, and what I do think works. I do think that we have tried to become more transparent. It used to be we published a story and we didn't tell you how we did the story. We didn't tell you anything about the reporter. We didn't tell you anything about the reporter's background. And this comes in an era in which there are just far fewer reporters than when I started. When I started, as we talked about earlier, lots of people knew reporters, right? Newsrooms, medium-sized newsrooms had 500-600 people. Every city had 2 newspapers. Some cities had 3. I grew up in a newsroom in New Orleans that had like 400 people. So people knew reporters. They were part of their lives. That's not the case anymore because all those newsrooms are much smaller. So one thing we try to do now is you have to say, here's how we did the work. By the way, here's the reporter. Here's the reporter talking about her work so that you can see the reporter doesn't look like an anchor person. The reporter looks like a normal, slightly schlubby newspaper reporter. Forgive me for the newspaper reporters who are here. And I think that showing what I made a decision when I was editor that I remember the publisher later told me he disagreed with. A documentary film crew wanted to come in and film in the New York Times newsroom as we started to cover the Trump era. And I said yes. I said yes without asking the publisher. That is not a good idea. Even though we're close, that was not a good idea. But I did it because I believed that if people actually saw how a newsroom operates, that they would like us, that they would actually see how hard we work. They would see how that we're all human beings. They would see the scene of Maggie Haberman, who's one of the great American beat reporters. There's a scene in that documentary where Maggie is working a very long day and her child calls. And like any parent, she's overwhelmed and she sort of leaves the room and she sort of falls to the ground and starts talking to her kid. And it's a very emotional scene. And I just thought people should see that that's who we are. Like a woman raising children who is also a newspaper reporter. And I think that if people saw that and understood that's who we were, it could only help us.
And how do you think the journalists reacted to that? I think for so long, even when I was in J school, we were always taught not to be part of the story and to kind of not really be visible. But now we're sort of doing quite the opposite, having them, you know, on Instagram, like we talked about earlier, and very visible.
At first, people were reluctant, but now I realize that journalists by their nature are sort of hams. So I think by the end, I think and look, individual journalists understand that we're in a crisis where we're fighting for our audience to believe us. So I think that by now they all think that this is my way to help win support for journalism. I'm all in.
And during the time that you led the Times, during Trump's first administration, the Times did a ton of great reporting, accountability reporting, tough stories on the president. But as you know, the public still voted him back into office. What does that say to you about the Times, about the media?
You know, first off, you do have to. Why Donald Trump won, why Donald Trump was elected is a complicated discussion, which I'm happy to take a stab at. But I will also point out, and so I'm not going to judge that part. I will also point out that I think that people read and believed much of what the press said about Donald Trump. I do. Part of that's evidenced by his current poll numbers. Part of it's evidence if you read the interviews with people who voted for Trump, they acknowledged all the things that had been reported. They acknowledged his issues with women. I mean, every voter we asked, they didn't say, we don't believe that. They said, yes, we believe that, but we voted for him for this reason. Frankly, I actually think the press, the mainstream press, did a really good job covering this election. And I can say that as somebody who wasn't involved in running election coverage. I think it was tough, honest, fair. And I think this is the fight for us to get to be treated and to be regarded by the audience the way I believe we deserve. The fight, the transparent fight that I'm describing is going to go on for a very long time. And I think the main thing we have to do is stick to our principles. Don't bend our principles in an effort to defeat Donald Trump. Don't bend our principles in an effort to win the war of winning support from our readers. Hold on to your soul. Make the kind of changes that you have to make to reach a wider audience, which we did. But I think when I was an investigative reporter for the Chicago Tribune, I was always doing in Chicago. Nothing ever changes. People would tease me. I did the series that won the Pulitzer was about corruption in Chicago City Council, and one of my friends who worked elsewhere said to me, "That took you a year to do." So, but I think that all those stories actually did contribute to Chicago having a sense of itself, which is the reason we're all laughing about it.
We talked about the attacks from the president. Let's talk about his use of litigation against the press. We're starting to see some settlements. In his second term, ABC News settled a defamation suit to the tune of $16 million paid to the Trump Presidential Library. And now President Trump has sued CBS over a 60-minute story. And its parent company, Paramount, has entered settlement talks. Curious, as this plays out behind the scenes, what you're thinking?
I think if CBS, based on what I've seen of the outtakes, I don't think CBS did something that merits a ginormous legal settlement. I don't think CBS libeled Donald Trump. I think that everybody I've talked to, and right after we reported that CBS was considering a settlement, I sent notes to about 10 people I know who are lawyers, and everybody thought this was a frivolous lawsuit. Everybody. And I gotta hope and pray that CBS does not settle what everybody thinks is a frivolous lawsuit, because it will make life harder for us. I mean, we have gotten, during my time as editor, tons of threatening letters from the people around Trump and from others who didn't like a story, and because they didn't like a story, said that they'd been libeled, or believed that something hadn't been included in the story that they thought should have been included, and therefore said that they were libeled. So I think if CBS settles, unless there's something we don't know, I think that would be a really awful outcome for us, for the press.
And if there's a harassment angle here, a lot of people in the media consider Trump's use of,
It costs a lot of money to defend yourself in one of these lawsuits. And in the case of CBS, it also threatens to thwart a merger that they're involved in, but it costs a lot of money to defend yourself.
are you worried at all about Sullivan, the libel law holding? A lot of our students have been looking at that law and are familiar with it. Does that concern you?
You know, this is another one of those cases where I lean on reporting. David Enrich, who covers this area for the Times, has written that he is worried about it. I've talked to a lot of lawyers who are less worried about it. There are two Supreme Court justices who've made noises about wanting to soften Sullivan, but others who haven't. Here's what I'm more worried about. What I'm more worried about is that news organizations, take the New York Times, the Washington Post, CBS off the table for 1 second. News organizations, apart from the giant ones, are really struggling. I mean, I spend a lot of time in my new job in newsrooms. They don't have, like, the New York Times, we're a publicly held company, so you probably know this. We have a lot of money in the bank. We can take care of ourselves. I worry about a lot of regional news organizations that don't have those resources. I'm worried about local officials who mimic what the Trump administration does in filing suits against them. Mississippi Today, which I've worked with a lot, which is a nonprofit news organization in Jackson, Mississippi, is spending a fortune defending itself from a lawsuit by the former governor of Mississippi. I worry as much about those cases that get a lot less attention because news organizations right now, unlike 30, 40 years ago when we were all rolling in cash and felt really protected by the court system, news organizations today are struggling financially. Not the New York Times, thank God, but a lot of the ones I spend time in, and a lawsuit by the governor of Mississippi or another state, boy, and you have to spend hundreds of thousands, if not millions, defending yourself. I worry about that a lot.
And for those small local newsrooms, do you think there is any mechanism really to fight a lot of these kind of frivolous lawsuits?
There are a bunch of people have gotten together. I mean, there's some terrific, the Reporters Committee and others that go in and help them. And there has been a really interesting discussion about whether or not there should be some sort of defense fund to help support local news organizations who face lawsuits. But, you know, in a way, the fear of a lawsuit is as deadening as a lawsuit, right? I mean, when I was an investigative reporter, you sit down, you write a story, you really strive for fairness, you really strive for balance, you really strive to make sure you have it. And these newsrooms that are smaller, that's hard to do anyway because it takes a while. And then if you have over your shoulder the fear of a lawsuit, sometimes it's okay to have a little bit of fear over your shoulder and make sure you get it right. But if you really have fear, it's going to make you think a lot harder as you assign stories. It's going to make you say, well, you know, if we investigate that guy, he might sue us. Let's talk about that. Once you say that, I'm worried, let's talk about it. That is not a journalistic discussion. That's a defense. I get it, but it's not a journalistic discussion. A journalistic discussion is, should we conduct this investigation because it's fair and it's important to our community? It is not a journalistic discussion to say, let's not do that one because we might get sued.
You talk about the mindset of being an investigative reporter, so I have to take you back to a moment.
How far back?
Well, 1990, that was the year you arrived at the New York Times. You're fresh off winning a Pulitzer in Chicago, and Joe Lelyveld brings you to New York. And according to Adam Nagorny's book, The Times, you were reporting directly to Lelyveld, and you could investigate whatever struck your fancy. So let's say you are plopped into today's environment with the flooding the zone and everything happening today. What do you go after? What's the first thing you chase?
I think that I think there's a lot of reporting to be done about the budget cuts and their effect on, cities, the states and the world. By the way, I wanna, I sometimes get criticized for saying this, but I'll say it anyway. The job of a news organization like the New York Times is not to be the enemy of Donald Trump's, it's not to be the leader of the resistance to Donald Trump. So if you investigate budget cuts, you really, every White House in my time has said the government's too big. So that you need to, you can't suspend that. You can't throw that out the window. But I think the most, possibly the two right off the bat, really understanding the impact of the budget cuts. I wonder, for instance, whether everybody understands that a state like Louisiana, where I grew up, more than 50% of its budget comes from the federal government. It's going to be very interesting when some of the southern governors and some of the red state governors confront that. Well, they already have confronted it, but when they decide what to do about it, I think that's an important story. I think that there's no question that this White House has thrown out all of the ways of examining conflicts of interest. They fired inspectors general. They've in the case of the military, they're getting rid of the lawyers who are supposed to raise questions about acts of war. Elon Musk, by his own account, is meddling in agencies that are supposed to regulate him, and openly talks about it. I mean, he was in a recent press conference. He said, we offer the better price, etc. So that is clearly, his role, the role of a private citizen, unelected, who has sprawling businesses and is a multi-billionaire, and is also has a big role, a big hand in the institutions that are supposed to police him. That is a major area for investigation.
Yeah, and now I want to roll back and go back to 2025. Back
I'm
to
trying to remember
present.
where I was.
Yeah, where were you? And talk a little bit about AI. I know this is something that's been on the minds of a lot of journalists. We're really seeing how artificial intelligence is changing the way that newsrooms are doing a lot of their work. A lot of these AI tools, however, aren't new. The Associated Press has been using AI since 2014 to generate its earnings reports and things like that. But what we're starting to see now, especially on the local level, that AI is being used to help, generate headlines and help with story ideas and transcribe things and really just freeing up a lot of reporters' time. We also know a few weeks ago, the New York Times released its own guidelines to AI, talking about them building their own language models, doing a lot of work with really just leveraging these tools. In your opinion, what is the role of AI in journalism and how should newsrooms be using it?
First, a warning. The last time we freaked out about a new technology, it was the internet. And we screwed up in responding to it. We were so afraid. We were so fearful that it would undermine everything we stood for, that we pretended it wasn't happening. And then when it happened, we still resisted it. And frankly, I don't have to tell you what the journalism landscape looks like, because we didn't, frankly, if you think back to it, we should have embraced it. The New York Times at its peak, before the internet, had a circulation of like 1 million. And now it's got an audience of 11 million. So even though that was hard fought, we cannot run away from the new technology. I have seen in my work tremendous examples of the possibilities of AI. From, I'm on the board of Cal Matters, which is a nonprofit news organization in California that covers state government, and they've built a tool that allows you to really deeply examine every piece of legislation that goes through the state government in a way that in my era would have been unimagined, right? We're working with a reporter now who we just gave a fellowship to, who's doing a story. I won't go into details because he's reporting on it, but it involves going through tens of thousands of documents. AI, we never would have finished that. We would have had to slice it and take a piece of it. AI is allowing us to do that in a very thoroughgoing way. There are things we're worried about. The Times is involved in litigation over our concerns that AI will just sort of scrape all of our work and not give us credit and create a whole new industry that we wouldn't be able to participate in. But in terms of being a tool for journalism, as long as it's regarded as a tool for journalism, my view is if it's gonna happen, you should embrace it. It's like it's gonna be as revolutionary as the internet. We should dive right in, learn everything we can about it, and seize it, and not pretend that it's some evil thing lurking, because the last time we did that, we got screwed, so.
Are there any major concerns that you have outside of kind of the litigation and things, just about how journalists are using it?
Sure, I haven't seen, I mean, of course, I have all the concerns everybody else have. I have concerns about deep fakes. I have concerns about the ability to, I mean, I have tons of concerns. And I don't want to, I don't want to take any of those concerns lightly. I just mean history tells us we need to learn it, understand it, take advantage of it, look for ways for it to make us better. I don't particularly care if AI writes earnings reports, frankly. I don't particularly care if AI covers, if there's a way for AI to cover high school sports. All of which newsrooms have to do to build their audiences and hold on to audiences. That doesn't bother me.
You've talked about how journalism has changed your life. And yet it remains an imperfect practice. And I wonder if we could get your thoughts now that you stepped down from the top job at the Times. Get your thoughts on elitism, the problem of elitism in journalism, particularly given your spectacular trajectory from the Seventh Ward of New Orleans and to the most powerful job in all of journalism.
I do think that we are a profession that has gotten to be too much of an elitist profession as a rule. I do think, first off, if you look at where I was recently in a meeting, we looked at where cuts were and where journalists were concentrated. They're concentrated in New York and they're concentrated in Washington. And the places that are losing the most journalists are in red states and in the middle of America and rural America. I do think that's a problem. I do think that in my own view is that in the era when advertising ruled, and now advertising does not, in the era where advertising ruled and newspapers were making tons of money, I think we had a distance from our audiences that I think in the end was unhealthy for us. I think we were, 80 to 90% of the revenue of a traditional newspaper came from advertising, which meant you didn't have to fight for readers, you didn't have to court readers, you didn't have to show readers how you do your work. And I also think that if you put journalism aside for a second, I do think that Americans right now, and I think frankly this has contributed to the rise of Donald Trump, I do think many Americans don't feel listened to. Many Americans don't feel like journalists, institutions, television, popular culture. I think many Americans feel like all of the institutions look down on them. They don't see themselves in it. And I think that's a form of elitism that I think if we don't think about and acknowledge, we're never gonna be able to figure out a way to court those readers and to win those readers. By the way, the publishers who are being criticized, like Bezos and the publisher of the LA Times, I think that in a very ham-handed, unjournalistic way, they're trying to grapple with that, right? They just don't know, frankly, quite what they're doing. But they're acknowledging in a way, and I'll say it again what I said earlier, it ain't good for anybody if the elites of America read the New York Times and the Washington Post. The elites, when I say people with money and people of a certain educational level, read the New York Times and the Washington Post, and everybody else watches Fox News, which frankly is not that far off from where we are now. I don't think that's good for the country.
And what about, you mentioned the staffing in major newspapers. So, the Times has made great strides in becoming more diverse in terms of race and gender and age. But what about diversity of opinion, diversity of thought, reporters from military families,
Yeah.
religious families, first generation college
Yeah.
students.
I intentionally, so my background was, as you alluded to, is hardly elite. I mean, I grew up in the back of my father's restaurant in a working class neighborhood in New Orleans. Neither of my parents went to college. My mother didn't go to high school. So it's hard. I don't know. I did wake up one day and people said I was elite. It's hard to, and I get it. I was the executive editor of the New York Times. How could I not be? But was very jarring to me to suddenly think of myself that way. I do think, I know diversity is supposed to be a bad word these days. I think a newsroom is supposed to be diverse in a lot of different ways. I did go out of my way to make sure I hired people who'd been in the military. They have a different perspective. You do want a mix of people in your newsroom of different backgrounds and histories. You can't ask people, did you vote for Trump or did you vote for Harris? You can't hire that way. First off, I'm not sure it's legal, but secondly, that's an oversimplistic, that reduces all of the differences between people to politics to one, and that's not the richness of diversity. Diversity is, the newsrooms I grew up in, women had very little power. News reports changed when women came into newsrooms. They saw the world differently. News reports changed when Black people and Latinos came into newsrooms. They saw the world differently. A news report, by its very nature, is sort of this imperfect attempt to capture factually and honestly the news of the day. But that's an imperfect construct. It's got to be, because sometimes you can't even know. Sometimes I read the history of a moment that I covered, and the historian captures in a way I had no idea at the moment, right? Gene Roberts, who was the great editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer, once said, he was asked what was the biggest story missed by his generation. And he said it was the migration of Black people from the South to the North, which transformed politics and transformed cities. And he said because newsrooms didn't have anybody who was migrating or whose families were migrating. So I believe that a newsroom really should have different perspectives, different ideas. And I think that that's going to bring you much closer to having an honest news report in what is, by its nature, an imperfect endeavor.
And the biggest story missed by our generation?
Oof. I think probably I would have to say the forces that led to the election of Donald Trump. I think all of us were. Any editor who tells you that he knew Donald Trump was going to win, I don't buy it. I've had this conversation with Marty Barron, who's a close friend. None of us knew. I don't think we had a handle on the country. I don't think we understood how much anger there was. I don't think we understood how much race is a factor in American life still. It seems weird to say that, but I don't think we understood that. I don't think we understood the way people viewed elites. I don't think we understood the sort of economic fallout, and I don't think we understood how the country went from electing Barack Obama to electing Donald Trump. I still don't think we fully have a handle on it, but I don't think we understood that.
I think one more question from Adriana, and everyone get your questions ready because after that we will go to audience questions.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the local work that you're doing. You said that local journalism is some of the most important work being done in journalism today, and you realized that a lot more after leaving your post at the New York Times. What do you think you were missing before?
I grew up in local journalism. I started working in New Orleans at an afternoon paper in New Orleans, and then went to work for the morning paper, then the Chicago Tribune. I sort of intellectually knew that there was a crisis in local journalism, but by the time I left, I was presiding over a newsroom with 2,000 people, and I was waking up every day thinking about how to cover the world, how to cover, a complicated country and an even more complicated world, and it was just sort of an intellectual thing. I hadn't been in a regional newsroom in a very long time, and then after I created this the Times created this program. I started visiting newsrooms, and I spent a week in Jackson, Mississippi, and I went to every newsroom in Jackson, Mississippi, and I went to the Jackson Clarion Ledger was the first stop, which is owned by Gannett. And I know they were great, by the way. But they asked me to do an all hands meeting, just like talk about journalism. And, you know, they were in this giant building that took up a square block in downtown Jackson. Most newspapers have sold their buildings, but if you've ever been to downtown Jackson, it's not a hot real estate market. So I met with them. I loved that newsroom, but that newsroom has about 20 people. The newsroom, when I worked at the Times-Picayune in New Orleans, Jackson was like, that's a big newsroom. I'm sure there were 300-400. So once I started visiting those newsrooms and I started talking to reporters and I started getting a sense of how hard it is to cover a community with that few people, that's when I started to see a little more of how much of a crisis.
We'd love to start hearing from students. And also, if any of the journalists in the room would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. We have microphones going around. And please introduce yourself. Sounds good. And if you're in the back, feel free to step forward so Dean can see you. Gabrielle, go ahead.
Hi, sorry. Hi, my name is Gabriella Fine. I'm a senior studying journalism. I'm wondering what you think is the best way to cover Trump and prevent audience members from feeling this impending exhaustion and sense of doom every time their phones ping with a news notification, the way I feel.
Boy, I don't think there's a perfect way to cover a story like this. I do think that the closest thing I can come to an answer is to not only focus on what he says, and you do have to cover what he says, right? But to actually figure out a way to cover what he does. That's what I meant when I said the stories that move me now as a reader, now that I'm not running that coverage, and frankly, the Times and the Post are both doing a great job of it, as is the Globe, by the way, is the stories that move me are the stories where we actually, okay, here's what USAID does, here's what the cuts are, and here's what impact those cuts will have. I think you gotta just bang away at reporting and don't get so consumed by I've become my mantra when I give speeches at university at newsrooms these days is reporting is endangered. Partly because of all the cuts, partly because, you know, like snark is a little bit easy, right? Snark and fast opinions, like really easy, right? You can fill up your homepage. I think that you got to stay away from that and really report. Reporting's got to be the thing we can do that nobody else can do is report. And reporting has got to be our central craft, and that's got to dominate our coverage of Trump.
No, you're fine. Hi, dude. My name is Paul Anstad. I'm a sociology professor here at Brandeis. Thank you so much for coming. I wanted to ask you a little bit about coverage of protests. Obviously, covering Donald Trump is a big part of the divided America, but covering protests is also very important. And I wanted to ask you about the use of passive voice in headlines. For example, in the New York Times in May 2020, a New York Times subheading read, from a television crew assaulted by protesters to a photographer stuck in the eye, journalists have found themselves targeted on the streets of America. And when you read the article, the journalist who was struck in the eye was struck by a rubber bullet fired by police officers. So I wonder if you could offer some guidance in terms of how that's handled on like an editorial level and what your thoughts on that usage is.
I'll answer both. First, protests. Protests are among the hardest things to cover in general. First off, there are a lot of protests in America, which is good. We're a society that sometimes it's hard to know how big they're going to be, which ones to cover. Don't overestimate how big newsrooms are. And everybody thinks we can go to every protest. It's really hard. And sometimes that decision about which protests to go to. I've heard, so on the headlines, I have heard the criticism that news organizations and sometimes, and the Times too, sometimes are too passive in the constructs of their headline. And I have, there were some cases, I'll only talk about my time, which that one was, I think. There were cases in which when it was called to my attention, I acknowledged that a headline was either too passive or wrong, and I've said that publicly. So I think we have to be careful with our headlines, to be frank. They didn't used to be that important in the print era. They didn't, right? You would pick up, and we're still a medium in transition. You would pick up the print newspaper, and if you had 5 stories on the page, they were all about one country or one thing, you didn't need a headline. You need a headline. The headline wasn't as important. So I think we have to be careful about our headlines to make sure they're as direct as possible. And in my time as editor, which I'll focus on, sometimes we got that wrong.
Okay, Josh, go ahead.
Great, we've got a question from a student.
Hi, my name is Maribel Rowland. I'm also a senior here studying journalism. And I read in the Q&A that you actually dropped out of college. And I know you had
Don't do that. I'm not recommending that. I did drop out of college, but don't do that.
So I'm currently considering a master's degree, and I was just wondering what your advice is in getting experience versus getting more education.
Oh, boy. I assume everybody heard the question, right? I really regret dropping out of college. I'm not just saying that for, I think the best journalists are widely educated. I think the best journalists have read history, because every moment that we confront has had some antecedent, even if it's not a direct antecedent. And I think the best journalists, I'm an avid reader of fiction, probably more than nonfiction, because I've spent so much of my life reading news and nonfiction. I think the best journalists are widely educated, open-minded, open to other ideas. So I strongly urge education. I also think that, the answer, sadly, the answer is both. You also have to have experience. If I had to do it all over again, I wouldn't have dropped out. I might even have taken another year and gotten a master's in something, not journalism. Not that there's anything wrong with, I believe in journalism schools, but something completely different that would have challenged me. In the last 10 or 15 years, I've gotten very interested in the visual arts. If I had to do it over again, I might have, tried to stumble my way into a master's in the arts, just because the more you know about stuff, the better journalist you're going to be. So I would say stay in school and study stuff that has nothing to do with journalism, because frankly, everything has to do with journalism.
Great. Neil, go ahead.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Hetty. I'm a junior here at Brandeis studying journalism also, and just thank you so much for being here. and
Don't
for your
drop out.
lessons. I will not.
I think I'm going to have a t-shirt made. Don't drop out.
But I wanted to ask, this is sort of in relation to the question about covering protests, but I wanted to just get your opinion, your thoughts on how the New York Times handled the Tom Cotton editorial situation. I know you had no direct oversight of that because of the firewall between the news section and the op-ed editorial section, but I know a lot of the internal complaints from newsroom employees who said it made them feel unsafe were under your supervision. So I'm just wondering how, that whole situation played out, how you felt you handled that, and your just overall thoughts on the decision to keep it up with that editor's note appended to it.
I think there are not that many questions that will throw me for a loop and are hard for me to answer, including criticism. I don't mind criticism. This one's a little trickier just because it was a decision made by the publisher. And I don't know for those who don't know, I controlled the newsroom, and the opinion side of the house, who are the columnists and the editorial page, which is a much smaller and very powerful operation, is not under the purview of the editor. And while I reported to the publisher, good publishers never get involved in coverage, whereas good publishers do get involved in opinion, right? I mean, it should be the publisher's decision whether or not whether or not the opinion pages are pro-choice or not. So I'm probably gonna punt and just say that AG Sulzberger, who made the decision, who's a close friend, an ally, and who I think makes smart decisions, that was his call, and I'm probably gonna stay away from it since there's a lot I don't know, and because I feel like I should just honor that wall between news and opinion. Sorry. Don't drop out though.
Hi, I'm Eli. I'm a senior anthropology and sociology double major here. My question for you is, how is the rise in short form content and like also the lessening of attention spans within not just my generation but all generations impacted the ways the New York Times or other mass media products look at how viewers view their content, how much time they're spending with the content, how much attention they're giving, and especially like with the attention economy, like how does that affect the New York Times?
A lot. You can hear me, right? My view is is not the role of, journalism should be a reflection of society. So it's not our role to like say, screw you, you want that, we're not gonna give it to you. So if you look at the current New York Times, like look, I'm sure today's coverage of whatever the news is, you'll see live coverage, which is sort of short snippets capturing the news of the moment. That is an acknowledgement that people take in news in a different way. That is an acknowledgement that we're no longer this thing that appears on your doorstep 24 hours after the event. And it's an acknowledgement that the best way to cover some stories is with a paragraph or 2 paragraphs or 3 paragraphs. And I think that's really, I think that's the right way to think. As long as you also do, I don't know if you saw it, this amazing takeout magazine piece the Times did on the Murdoch family and the fights within the Murdoch family. That made up for a lot of short paragraphs. It was the whole magazine. And to me, that is saying we believe in long form narrative journalism and we will deliver that. But we also understand that some news events are better covered in a different way and that people don't want to read every 5 minutes the 1,500 word or 2,000 word version of what happened today in the White House. So I think what you should do is you should lean into the technology. The first mistake we made when we all started to embrace the internet, or what we thought was embracing it, is we took our stories that were written and edited for print and our headlines and everything else, and we just put them on the internet. We said, see, we're like, we got it. Well, we didn't get it. That was like, the people read differently, and you should acknowledge that, and you should give them that. As long as you also, if you're a big newsroom with great ambitions, you should also do other stuff as well. So.
Right. I think Professor Fairley?
Hi, I'm Maura. I teach with all of the professors you've met. I met you in the hallway. I'm going to share a statistic with you that I read late in 2016, early in 2017, by way of seeing if I can get you to say a bit more about 2 issues that you touched upon at the end. Namely, the fact that we didn't know Trump was going to win in 2016 and that local journalism is in trouble. And the statistic is this: 73% of journalists in America in 2016 lived in a county that was won by Hillary Clinton. And a lot of that is because of the news deserts in the interior.
Totally
and
right.
What are we going to do about local journalism? It is a really big problem.
There's a lot being done, including the program that I'm leading. But now I've started going into, there's a whole world now of local nonprofit news organizations. It's very nascent. Some of them are struggling. Some have 5 people, some have 20 people. Some have, I've been in newsrooms that have 2 people. And I think that one thing we can do is support those news organizations, teach them, which is one thing I'm trying to do, work with them, encourage philanthropists, particularly local philanthropists, to contribute to sustaining them. I don't think it's going to work if just like the big 5, the Ford Foundation and whomever else just funds all of them. I don't think that's the answer because they can't. It's too big a problem. But if I can give you a ray of hope, I went to last week. I was at a conference that was hosted by the Knight Foundation that essentially was about local news, and there were 1,000 people there. Editors, reporters, publishers, people who have 3-person newsrooms, one guy who was like the reporter, editor, and publisher of his newsroom. There's a lot of stuff going on. I think we can do a better job helping them and calling attention to them. But I don't want to pretend it's a crisis. And it is frankly a crisis that I think is a reason why everybody was surprised at the outcome everybody is surprised by the outcome of elections. I do think it's a reason why some people are more or less likely to believe the things they read because there aren't any newspapers or news organizations, forget newspapers, there aren't any news organizations in their regions. It's a crisis. And I think we have to talk about it. I think we have to, there's another statistic, if that came from Northwestern's study, because I've seen that, there was another statistic that was even scarier to me. I think it was 70% of all Americans think local news organizations are doing just great. It's because we haven't told them. They're not doing great. They're almost all losing money. Almost everybody's losing money. And many of these regional news organizations, frankly, are going to fail. They're going to, I don't see how they can sustain themselves. I mean, there's a certain point where you can't keep cutting. So no, it's a crisis. I think we have to keep talking about it and encourage local people to contribute money to and and being willing to pay for news.
We have a student question. Lauren, take it away.
Hi, my name is Lauren Williams. I'm a senior studying journalism, and I read that an advice that you give to reporters when they're going out for an assignment is to be good. And I'm wondering, what does that sentiment mean to you, and how has that evolved over time as media has vastly changed?
I think of it as a Southern, what I mean when I say that is, first off, it's a way to relax reporters. When I was I've spent most of my life as a reporter. When I went out on a big story, especially in the era of competition, I was always scared to death. Would I get beat? Would I get it wrong? Would I understand it? It's complicated, right? It's like every good reporter goes into a story really anxious. We don't acknowledge it enough, but really. So when I would say that to a reporter, I meant chill out a little bit, relax. We have a lot of things built in to keep you from getting it wrong, and also enjoy it. That's what I meant. If that answers the. I also, can I say one other thing? I do think that one thing reporters have to remember too is, don't think you know the story before you go after the story. Like, greatest sin of reporters. I'm going to Louisiana, where I believe, X has happened and it's devastated the community. That's not reporting. That's just affirmation. The right way to think is, I am going to this place where this event has happened, and hopefully I'm going to be surprised. To me, that's like the essence of reporting. Hopefully I'm going to learn something I didn't know before I got on the airplane.
Rosie, go ahead.
Hi, my name's Rosie. I'm a freshman and I'm a linguistics and film major. And I wanted to ask you that you were on a podcast episode with Michael Barbaro on The Daily, and you said that as a journalist or member of media, you, quote, do have to tell people what to think, end quote. And I understand your point, which is that, we all have a responsibility to consult many different media outlets before coming to conclusions. But to what extent do you think that this perspective contributes to cancel culture on college campuses? And
did I say what to think, or remind me of the quote? Because it sounds like something I said inarticulately. But go ahead. I'll tell you what my belief is. But ask me.
Of course, there's context that I'm not including, but
No,
you said
okay.
You do have to tell people what to think as a journalist.
I actually don't think you have to tell people what to think. And if I said that, that was one of many foot in mouth episodes. I do think that what I hope I meant is that there are sometimes you have to tell people something they don't want to hear, not what to think. You should never tell people what to think. I do think that sometimes our job is to tell people things they don't want to hear. I think a lot of people did not want to hear that Joe Biden actually was diminished because of his age, frankly. And I think that the responsibility of journalists and a lot of people, especially I said that, by the way, before the debate and was actually heckled by some journalists in the audience. That's what I mean, that sometimes you have to tell people things they don't want to hear. So if I said it the other way, that was my foot in my mouth. So apologies.
Hi, my name is Jatea. I'm a first year studying journalism. Considering your experience with smaller, more local journalism, as you know, a lot of people have taken it upon themselves to report or discuss the news or media through social media or podcasting. So with your experience and your opinion, what do you think makes someone a reliable journalist or a reliable source?
You know, journalism is a pretty big tent, right? I mean, the New York Times has always coexisted with The Nation and, with William F. Buckley, right? So journalism is a pretty big, I think it depends on the role. I mean, the New York Times has taken on the role of being independent and nonpartisan. The Nation which I respect, and, has a very different role than ours. I don't disrespect The Nation, nor do I disrespect some publications that have a conservative bent that just are different from the New York Times. We've always had that. So I don't disrespect that. What I disrespect, the reason I'm not a fan of Fox News, for instance, which I think is frankly, national Fox News is not good for our discussion about the democracy. It has nothing to do with the politics. It has to do with, they don't tell you that their politics is really driving their coverage. Do I think the New York Times has gotten that wrong sometimes too? Of course. But I honestly believe when we've gotten it wrong, it was a screw up. Whereas I think that when you make Tucker Carlson your star, that's intentional. And I don't have a whole lot of respect for Tucker Carlson. Does that answer your question? Okay. Don't drop out.
Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for being here. My name is Mina Rowland. I am also a senior and I self-designed my major. It's multimedia storytelling. And I guess I'm curious, since you talked about if you were to take on another year in school and go to a grad program, you would do visual arts. Kind of curious, the intersection of combining art and the creativity with journalism. There's a journalist I follow, Malaka Garib, who works for Life Kit on NPR, and she makes op comics. So I'm very curious, I guess, to hear your opinion about, the evolving nature of combining art with journalism.
Of art and journalism?
Yes.
But that's also been around for, some of the great, American journalism filled with terrific critics. And they're one of my great joys as editor of the New York Times is the critics would take me places with them. And there's nothing cooler than going through, a gallery show with somebody who actually knows what they're looking at, who can describe it to you. I honestly think just that a good journalist really is open to all kinds of stuff. And I think if you want to be an art critic or write about the arts and the future of the arts is a very big story in America, right? It's going to be even bigger. It's just going to be, just as museums and galleries were starting to move in one direction in the post-George Floyd era, I think the Trump administration is going to want to, just like universities, is going to try to pull them back in this direction. And that tension is going to be a really important story, best covered by people who have a sense of the history and have a sense of the longer view of the role of art in journalism, et cetera. So, my God, take all the courses you can. And if you walk out of school knowing a lot about art with all the journalistic skills, you will be very marketable.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Sabine von Mehring. I'm a colleague here at Brandeis and originally from Germany and a long time subscriber. So I take a look at the coverage through the lens of a climate activist, and there isn't much. And it's been really upsetting. Like I keep tabs on how often does the climate crisis actually make it to the front page, top fold? Hardly ever. And when it does, it's either because there is a catastrophe or because someone invented something that is supposed to be the big solution. And I realize in thinking about that, that it isn't news, right? It is an ongoing crisis that is developing and getting worse on a daily basis, but it isn't news every day because of that. And so I wonder if that's part of the problem, and is that something that news organizations have to actually adapt somehow to, because it wasn't a topic in the election. It wasn't even a topic in the German election last week. And it is accelerating at a pace that is really, really, really frightening. And yet it is simply absent.
You know, I think I'm gonna say I'm not sure I agree that it's not present in the report. And as you said that, I mean, I can remember 2 days ago, there was a story on the front page. Maybe that's not enough, and I'm willing to, I'm not sure it's not present in the coverage. And there's a very large climate desk at the Times, and I'm sure the Post has the same thing. And I think it's acknowledged that it's not, that it's enterprise reporting, that it's a visual story too. So I'm not sure I 100% agree with you. I mean, you may know so much more. Pardon me? But you're counting the front page. That is like the least read part of the New York Times. Just, I mean, I'm not 100% sure I agree that it's not a dominant, important story emerging in the coverage of the Times and the Post. And I'm happy to see the evidence. I'm also happy to be wrong, but I'm not sure I completely agree on that.
We have time for one more student question. And if we have a journalist question, please let us know. Go ahead. Yeah.
Hello. I graduated from Brandeis a couple years ago from the journalism program, and I am now an 8th grade teacher in a city where a majority of my students are either immigrants themselves or their parents are immigrants. And I'm currently teaching them a class about media literacy and about journalism. And I try to go through like the news of the day with them because there's a lot of news, you know, coming out every day. And it seems to me that a lot of them associate the news with very negative things, and they almost don't want to watch it because every time they hear the news, especially for them, it's always really bad news. So I've kind of been struggling with, and I'm wondering if you could maybe give some advice on how I can make them not associate the news with
Yeah.
like horrible things.
That's like something we struggle with, right? I think I actually wonder if you actually took apart a day in the life of the New York Times and the Washington Post, if it's as negative as we think. And when I say that is we focus on Trump, we focus on crisis in the world and in the country. But truth be told, if you take the whole, I mean, take print, even though print is not read as widely as digital. I mean, there's a whole section devoted to the arts. You know, on some days, there's a whole section or several pages devoted to sports. There's a weekly food section. You know, there's a weekly science section. There's a weekly book review. There's on some Sundays like 2 art sections. I think first off, the fact that you're teaching kids about journalism, if I had a hat, I would tip it to you. I think that's fantastic. But I do think there's a lot in news that's not just crisis. And I think we need to do maybe we need to do a better job in journalism, pushing it front and center. We try. The reality is the phone, it's like the shock to the system for those like me who grew up in the print era. The phone is less accommodating than we want it to be. But there's a lot in daily news that's not just about crisis, and that captures the richness of the culture, that's funny. There's a lot of stuff. I mean, my only advice is to just make sure that that stuff gets read as much too. And frankly, a lot of that stuff is not controversial. You know, I mean, if you know, Louisiana is a state that has many divisions, but if you go to an LSU football game, there's like literally 100,000 people. And I think who knows who voted for whom. I think it's to encourage people to pay attention to the parts of journalism that are not just about the five ginormous. I don't think you should ignore those stories. We're in a historic moment, but I would try to show people the other stuff too.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Any students who didn't get to ask the question, you'll have another chance tomorrow. We're lucky enough to have Dean come to our classroom.
Thank you, by the way.
But before we wrap up, before anyone gets up, I want to make it clear that at this point, our visiting journalists are going to be leaving the room to visit with some university colleagues. And two of our terrific alumni, Scarlett and Maddie, please raise your hands. Will be leading those folks where they need to go across campus. And for everyone else, we encourage you to stay. And in the intermission, you're going to, well, you're in for a treat. We've got student leaders will be running a fun game of Journalism Jeopardy. And we'll have some food and prizes. And then at 7 o'clock, we'll all reconvene in this room for the second panel. Where our colleague Neil Swidey will lead Dean in a broader discussion about polarization in the media.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks so
everyone.
much.